On the morning of March 5th, 1776, a British sentry on the walls of Boston looked toward the harbor and went cold. Overnight, on the hills of Dorchester, an entire fortress had appeared. Cannon, earthworks, firing platforms, all of it aimed directly down at the most powerful fleet on Earth. No one had heard a thing. Within hours, the word reached the British commander, and he understood at once that the siege of Boston was lost. In a single night, George Washington had outmaneuvered an empire. This is how he did it. His name was George Washington, and what he found when he took command horrified him. The men were not really an army at all. They were farmers, tradesmen, and boys, camped in the mud and snow outside Boston. Many had no shoes. Some had no muskets. Disease moved through the tents like fire. Enlistments were expiring, and soldiers were simply walking home. At times, Washington had less than half the gunpowder he needed to fight a single serious battle. He kept that secret, terrified that if the British ever learned the truth, they would march out and destroy him. So Washington faced an impossible question. He could not storm the city. His men would be slaughtered against those fortifications and those guns. But he could not simply wait, because waiting meant watching his army starve and desert. Night after night, he sat alone in his headquarters at Cambridge, studying maps of the harbor by candlelight, searching for a way in. The answer, when it came, was daring to the point of madness. If he could not break the British with his soldiers, he would break them with something they could not answer. He would take the high ground. But taking the high ground meant nothing without cannon, and Washington had almost none. The guns he needed were 300 miles away at Fort Ticonderoga, captured from the British months earlier and now sitting useless in the wilderness of upstate New York. To bring them to Boston in the dead of winter seemed insane. No one believed it could be done, except a 25-year-old bookseller named Henry Knox. Knox had never commanded anything in his life. He had learned about artillery from the very books he sold, and he volunteered for what should have been an impossible mission. What followed became a legend. Knox and his men loaded 59 cannon, 60 tons of iron, onto wooden sleds. Then they began to drag them home, across frozen rivers that cracked beneath the weight, over snow-choked mountain passes, through forests where the trail vanished under drifts. Teams of oxen strained against ropes as the guns slid and tipped and had to be hauled up by hand. It took 56 brutal days, but in January of 1776, Henry Knox rode into Washington's camp with the cannon that would change the war. The target was Dorchester Heights, a pair of hills south of the city that looked down over Boston and its harbor. Whoever held those heights controlled everything below. Incredibly, the British had left them undefended, certain no army could ever fortify them in time. That certainty was about to become their undoing. From it was Price was executed. Washington's plan was precise. On a single night, thousands of men would climb the heights and build an entire fortress before sunrise, while the ground was still frozen too hard to dig. To hide the sound of the work, he would give the British something else to listen to. For 3 nights, American cannon opened fire on Boston, a thunderous bombardment that lit the winter sky. The British guns roared back, and both sides traded fire across the water. To the redcoats, it looked like the same futile shelling they had shrugged off for months, but it was a mask. Under the cover of that noise, on the night of March 4th, the real operation began. Along the road to Dorchester Heights, Washington had bales of hay laid down to swallow the sound of the wheels. And then, In the darkness, 2,000 men began to move. They worked in near silence and with astonishing speed. Because the frozen earth could not be dug, Washington had prepared another way. His men carried pre-built wooden frames, bundles of sticks, and barrels packed with earth up the slope, and assembled a fortress like a puzzle in the dark. No shouting, no fires, just the muffled sound of thousands of hands building through the freezing night. Ox carts hauled the great cannon up the hill behind them. Hour after hour the walls rose, until, as the first gray light touched the sky, the impossible had been finished. When the sun rose on March 5th, the British looked up at Dorchester Heights and could not believe their eyes. Where there had been an empty hillside the day before, there now stood a fortress, bristling with cannon, aimed straight down at their ships and their men. General Howe stared through his telescope in stunned silence. It is said he lowered it and murmured that the rebels had done more in one night than his whole army could have done in months. Every ship in the harbor, every soldier in the city now lay under American guns. Howe faced a bitter choice. He could storm the heights, sending his men up an open slope into the muzzles of those cannon and risk a slaughter worse than Bunker Hill. Or he could abandon Boston entirely. Pride demanded an attack, and Howe ordered one. But then the sky itself seemed to take Washington's side. A violent storm exploded over the harbor that night, with winds and waves so fierce that no boat could cross. The assault was impossible. By the time the storm passed, Howe's nerve had broken. There would be no attack. The British would leave. What followed was one of the great humiliations in British military history. For days, the docks of Boston churned with panic as 9,000 soldiers and 1,000 terrified loyalists crowded onto the ships. They took what they could carry and abandoned the rest. Then, on the 17th of March, 1776, the most powerful navy on earth hoisted its sails and fled the city it had held for years, driven out without a single major battle. From the heights, the American soldiers watched the enemy fleet shrink into the horizon and disappear. Washington rode into a liberated Boston as a hero, and the legend of the man who bested an empire was born. But the true lesson of Dorchester Heights was never really about cannon or hills or even that stormy night. Washington had won because he understood the war better than his enemy did. He did not need to be stronger than Britain. He only needed to be patient, to be daring at the right moment, and to make his enemy's position impossible. It was a lesson he would spend the next 7 years teaching the most powerful empire in the world. They were not just beaten that morning. They were outthought.